What's that? Take cover. It's another heretic!
Hello, everyone. This is another heretic or Brother Nathan, whichever you prefer. Um, so going to be a little more casual today. We're going to continue reading through Rulers of Evil, Tupper Saucy. If you want, you can open the PDF, which is found available for free at my website, anabaptistapologist.com. Go to the library tab. Okay, scroll all the way down. You will find Rulers of Evil. You click that. And today, if you go down here and you type in 120, it will take you to chapter 12, Lorenzo Ricci's War. So we're going to take a break from the other series on 1913 and the origin of our slavery and solutions to our slavery. Let me just show you really quick here from YouTube. You can go to YouTube and find me there. Another heretic. And my latest two,
He dares to
the latest two in my podcast on my channel is all right,
Hello,
1913
everyone.
and solutions towards slavery. We've been looking at the tax system, basically, our system of government and society in general, and looking at a point in history where it really began to go wrong. But as we're learning here from Tupper Saucy, really the downfall of America began long ago. And a lot of it can be credited to not Israel, but rather the Jesuits. I believe my view is a little more nuanced than that. My view is that the Antichrist beast Babylonian system really is an amalgamation of different church and state entities. We have the Vatican, we have the nation of air quotes, so-called Israel, the synagogue of Satan. And then we have entities like the Rothschilds, the Bank of England, worldwide think tank organizations, Washington, D.C. All of these are basically hubs of the Babylonian beast system, in my view. So it's not just the Jews, it's not just Israel, it's not just the United States, it's not just the Vatican, it's all of these things. I think it forms a trifecta or a trinity, if you will. And I would say, is it any wonder that the major religions are still allowed to exist and flourish, even in a so-called age of enlightenment with atheism and just greater and greater secularism. We still have these major religions in the world. It's because they also are used as a means of control. And Jesus came to show us the way, the truth, and the life, the way of spirit, the way of the Father, right? The Father, the true creator, the God of love and mercy, the God who opposes bloodshed or sacrifice, human and animal. He truly does. He truly does. The true God, the true creator of him, of it, whichever, of the source of us all. He said he seeks such as would worship him in spirit and in truth, for God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. The Jesuits have a false deity, they have a false Christ, they have a false gospel, and their means is by all means save some is essentially their modus operandi, which originated with Paul or Saul of Tarsus, the false apostate apostle. And you can find information about that at my other website, www.doubtingpaul.com. It's written as a sort of pseudo epistle. I tried to write it in a very organized way and in the style of a sort of epistle, sort of mocking the idea that that the epistles are inspired, because I don't believe that they are, um, especially Paul's. So I wrote my own epistle to Paul and his followers, the disciples of Paul, and I state my case and I ask questions, and I believe I do a pretty good job of proving my thesis. So that can be found here. There's also a PDF available for free that you can print out and distribute. But yeah, Paul, Roman agent, and basically a proto-Jesuit. So, which I think betrays what I think the beast system is. I think the beast system is an amalgamation of the Roman Catholic Church and early apostate Judaism, which was basically just the Pharisaical, Sadducean, Herodian factions that came together and sold their soul to Satan when they rejected their Messiah, had him put to death underneath Roman authority. These two entities became one, and then they corrupted after they infiltrated, and they corrupted the early ecclesia assembly and turned it into a state church religion known as the Catholic Church. And then out of that comes the Protestants. Now, if Eastern Orthodox want to claim that they're the first before the Catholics, that the Catholics protested them, well, either way, you're both Antichrist. So it doesn't matter if you want to say that it's Eastern Orthodox predates the Catholics, or if the Catholics predate the Eastern Orthodox. It makes no difference to me, because they're both wrong. I would not want that. I would not make that claim. My claim is that Paul is the first corrupter, and that in order to have the true faith of Christ, you have to go back further. You have to look at the groups. You have to look at the Ebionites. So anyway, all of that sort of is my thoughts before I began reading Rulers of Evil. And so as we're reading through Rulers of Evil, what I'm saying is that I'm seeing a lot of similarities and correlations between the Jesuit tactics and the tactics of Paul, how Paul was able to win his so-called converts, and how Paul went about building his churches. It was namely through a sort of syncretic message that he becomes all things to all men, that he might by all means save some. The Jesuits take that as their motto, as their modus operandi. Okay. So all of that is foundational, or at least serves as the background, at least in my mind, for helping me understand what Mr. Saucy is saying here. So reading chapter 12 then, we're going to learn more about how this war by the Jesuits is waged. Lorenzo Ricci's strategy of dividing the British imperial system can be discerned in events occurring as early as 1752. In that year, Catholic interests in America were rather poorly managed by the Congregation for the Propaganda at Rome, depending upon a tangle of ambassadors or nuncios and intermediaries in Madrid, Paris, London, and Brussels. The Jesuit mission was to consolidate these often adversarial parts into a dynamic and independent whole governed directly from the mind of the Black Papacy, which was revealed earlier to be the presidency of the United States. And that's just based on the symbology that we find in the House where the president will come and he'll speak in the chamber or whatever you want to call it. Doesn't matter. You know, I don't care about Saturn temples. I don't care about the sacrilegious blasphemy and respecting the pronunciations of these people and their offices. It doesn't matter. But, you know, it is what it is. The symbols are found in America because America is basically the Trojan horse that allowed the Vatican and Mossad, which are basically Jesuit fronts, in my opinion, to come in and to corrupt the seed of liberty that had been planted in the soil. Um, in 1752, the Society of Jesus was brilliantly powerful and had been so for nearly a century. Most statesmen, a fine Jesuit historian has written, quote, reckoned that the society was a major force in politics and international great power, acting primarily for its own interests, end quote. Lorenzo Ricci had been spiritual father of this great power for nearly a year, although that title assured him of unanimous election as superior general upon the demise of General Luigi Centurioni, presently endowed him with diplomatic oversight embracing the whole world. Ricci's particular geographic interests included France and its possessions in New France, the whole Mississippi Valley, from Canada and the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico, and England and its colonies in New England, all the lands to the south of French Canada and north of Spanish Florida, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific coasts. Wow. Both empires were, to a certain extent, Jesuit driven. Great Britain was run by the Catholic loathing system of Freemasonry, whose highest adepts obeyed the Reverend Unknown Superior. France was run by Louis the 15th, who obeyed the same superior through his Jesuit confessor, Pere de Sassy, or Saki. Again, doesn't matter. De Sacky's good-natured ministry reduced the king's dinner on a strict fast day from 8 courses to 5 and limited his wine consumption to 3 glasses per sitting. Sun Tzu wrote, I demand the art of making enemies move as one wishes. Those who possess that admirable art know how to arrange their men and the army they command in such a way that they make the enemy come toward them whenever they judge it appropriate. They know how to make generous gifts when appropriate, even to those they wish to conquer. They give to the enemy, and the enemy receives. They abandon things to him, and he comes to take them. They are ready for anything. They take advantage of any circumstance. I'm going to pause here real quick. And when I was reading this, one of the things that came to my mind was when Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, right? And Trump was all like, we got to get out of Afghanistan, blah, 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 blah. We got to pull out of the Middle East. So Biden pulls out of the Middle East, but botches it, air quotes, so bad that we leave all that equipment over there for these terrorist groups, which we had been funding all along through the CIA, just come and swoop up all those assets. I mean, uh, I mean, it's insane. Continue reading. They are ready for anything. They take advantage of any circumstance. Hillary Clinton, quote, never let a good crisis go to waste, end quote. How about Albert Pike, 33-degree Freemason, quote, if they require heroes, then we shall be the ones to provide them, end quote. It's a paraphrase, but look up those two quotes and tell me that the world is not the Jesuit stage, and we all indeed are players. Quote, they do not fully trust those whom they employ, but choose others to be their overseers. They do not count on their own strength alone, but use other means which they believe can be useful to them. They consider the men against whom they must fight to be stones or pieces of wood, which they have been asked to roll down a slope. You, therefore, who are commanding an army, must act in such a way that the enemy is in your hands, like a round stone that you have caused to roll down a mountain 1,000 paces high. Thus will be recognized that you have power and authority, and that you are truly worthy of the position you occupy. That was air quotes sun-tzu, which is believed to actually just be the pen name of a Jesuit. In any case, that's their modus operandi. Lorenzo Ricci transformed British and French colonial personnel into round stones by creating a crisis between their conflicting imperial claims to dominion in North America. In 1752, his spiritual fatherhood directed French soldiers and their Indian allies to destroy the important British colonial trading center on the upper Great Miami River. Then followed the plundering, capture or killing, not murdering, but papally absolved extirpating of every English-speaking trader in the upper Ohio Valley that the French and Indians could locate. Although these lands were legally British, dating from a grant to Virginia by King James I in 1609, the important Virginia families failed to emphasize with the misfortunes of explorer inhabitants in such remote and undeveloped wilderness. But when, toward the end of 1752, the Virginia government granted an additional 1,500,000 acres of Ohio Valley land, empathies burst into bloom. Suddenly, the Virginians had something to lose, and it was being lost to a band of Roman Catholics and their Indian converts. In 1753, French engineers constructed a chain of forts connecting Lake Erie with the Ohio River. The governor of Virginia dispatched a small militia to confront these Catholic trespassers. Leading the militia was a recent initiate into the Fredericksburg Masonic Lodge, 21-year-old Major George Washington. Washington warned the garrison at Fort Le Boeuf that it was illegally occupying Virginia real estate, quote, so notoriously known to be the property of the Crown of Great Britain. He read aloud the governor's demand that they depart. The French ignored him, and he returned home. Despite the clear indication that the French intended not to concede to the governor's demands, Virginia encouraged the Ohio Company to build a palisade fort at the fork where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers joined to create the Ohio River. Monongahela, where Pittsburgh now stands. The government pledged Virginian troops to support the venture. Construction began in the spring of 1754. Almost immediately, French and Indians descended upon the tiny crew of woodcutters and carpenters and overwhelmed them. By the time Washington, remember a Freemason, now a lieutenant colonel, could reach the scene, he was forced by Catholic firepower to fall back to Fort Necessity. Here, Washington surrendered on July 4th. It was this clash between British and French armies that precipitated what was called by contemporary writers the Maritime War, or Great War for the Empire, or 7 Years' War, or French and Indian Wars. It could more appropriately be called Lorenzo Ricci's War. Or what we would call today a banker's war, or, they're Jesuit wars, they're Freemason wars, they're Illuminati wars. You take all of these organizations that you've heard about and you just put them under one title, Jesuit. As these rounded stones began rolling, more succumbed to Ricci's gentle touch. The colony most affected by the fighting was Meek, Pennsylvania. The colony originally settled by adherents of the renowned Quaker leader William Penn. Penn had been dead a whole generation, and ownership of his colony had devolved upon a British cooperation, which included some of Penn's descendants and was known austerely as the proprietors. The proprietors wanted wars in Pennsylvania to be fought by Pennsylvanians. The Quakers, who controlled the assembly, abhorred the notion of Pennsylvanians bearing arms. When the assembly voted to raise a war chest, the Quakers stepped down and out of power. First, however, they appointed their most celebrated member, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, official printer of Pennsylvania's paper currency, to sail to London to represent them against the proprietors. Now, this is insane. Okay. Remember that the Freemasons are the Jesuits. Remember that the Jesuit modus operandi is to infiltrate as many facets of society, that if they have to pretend to be a Quaker to get in so that they can secure power, they will. And they play the very long game. So wouldn't you have it that Benjamin Franklin, who happened to be Grand Master of Pennsylvania Freemasonry, happens to be a Quaker in Pennsylvania, and he happens to be the one who gets tapped to be the representative, all the while having these nefarious ties. This underscores the need for us to be discerning. And one other comment. I agree with the Quakers about nonviolence and non-resistance. But that doesn't mean that you step down, right? Because then that creates a vacuum for then the violence to come in, right? So hold your ground, stay firm, stand on your principles, and don't budge is the other lesson that needs to be learned from this. Because we're seeing the machinations of the Jesuits afoot in our world today. And we need to stay in the gap, stand in the gap, be the ones who will be called blessed are the peacemakers, and not give an inch. Don't make the same mistake that the Quakers of old made back then. Hold your ground. Stand in your righteousness. We will win. So anyway, sorry. Dr. Franklin, who happened to be Grand Master of Pennsylvania Freemasonry, arrived in London to find that King George II, having made peace with France as recently as 1748, favored the proprietors. The king's attitude was, let Americans fight Americans. Franklin explained that Virginia's undisciplined militiamen and the pacifists of Pennsylvania were no match for seasoned French regulars and savage Indian braves. France was jeopardizing British imperial interests. The king acquiesced to Franklin's reasoning and ordered General Edward Braddock to take a small army to clear the forks of the Ohio of the French trespassers. He also sent Admiral Edward Boscawen's fleet to the Gulf of St. Lawrence to prevent the arrival of more French reinforcements in Canada. All this was in perfect obedience to Lorenzo Ricci's strategy of establishing a British military presence in America. The crown ultimately would require the Americans to pay for this presence, which would expose the colonists to taxation from afar, which they could readily be fomented to resist. The resistance would be met with harassment, which would incite rebellion and, ultimately, division. Wow. So people who otherwise aren't paying attention, or basically a lot of average people, end up becoming useful idiots to the ends of the Jesuits. Discernment, discernment, discernment. The philosophical similarities between Quakers and Loyolan Gnosticism should not escape our notice. Ooh, interesting. Quaker, the term, was first used by an English judge in 1650 to ridicule how the leader of that denomination, George Fox, admonished him to tremble at the word of the Lord. Fox summoned all who sought spiritual truth and peace to come out of the churches and to seek an intimate, personal relationship with Christ. Jesus of the Quakers spoke through inner illumination, a light available to all, having nothing to do with outward forms of ceremony, ritual, or creed. To the Quaker, every person was a walking church. Every heart was God's altar and shrine. There was no need, therefore, to attend steeple houses or pay taxes to support a state clergy, or doff a hat to king or commoner, or fight wars, or distinguish between sex or social class. Such doctrine, of course, was highly offensive to the Church of England, and so the Quakers were mercilessly persecuted as treasonous criminals. They found a haven across the Atlantic in the colony, conveniently granted by King Charles II to William Penn, one of the more outspoken English Quakers. Charles granted the land to settle a debt the crown owed Penn's deceased father, Admiral Sir William Penn. Knowledgeable contemporaries publicly charged the younger Penn with being a Jesuit in disguise. Actually, all Catholic clergy in England were to a certain extent in disguise, thanks to a law prohibiting Roman Catholics from wearing clerical garb. Promulgated with the intent of handicapping popery, the law might as well have been written by Jesuits, as its effect reduced the Jesuit profile to nothing, the level preferred by covert militias. 18th century London was teeming with disguised Jesuit missionaries trained at places like St. Omer's in moral theology, casuistry, equivocation, mental reservation, as well as espionage, cloak and dagger diplomacy, guerrilla tactics, and the manipulation of public opinion. William Perm's higher education began at Cardinal Wolsey's endowment for the furtherance of papal supremacy, Christ Church College at Oxford. Before completing Oxford, Penn was sent by his father to the small University of Saumur, France. Penn left Saumur, an accomplished propagandist less interested in achieving specific biblical objectives. Quote, "Much reading is an oppression of the mind," he would later advise his children. Oh, wow. And in establishing illuminated social justice through reason and natural understanding. His most influential work, the pamphlet No Cross, No Crown, published in 1669, agitated for Quaker separatism. So it sounds like Penn really is perhaps an infiltrator, not unlike Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, which would explain why Penn was willing to abdicate to Benjamin Franklin, who then goes to England, and then now England gets pulled into the fray militarily, right? So that makes sense. So it goes to show that they're very adept at playing this long game and inserting their agents into these otherwise grassroots movements in order to ultimately subvert those movements and bring them underneath the centralized control of the elites. Very interesting. So Charles II readily accommodated Penn's agitations by launching the Great Persecution of 1682, which created enormous migrations of die-hard Protestants and Catholics alike to the American colonies. If Penn was not the Jesuit he was believed to be, he was at least a rather superior Jesuit product, another in a long train of princes, designated proprietor in Penn's case, deferring to the Quakers' dislike for titles of nobility, well trained to populate, administer and defend their land grants in obedience to the will of the grantor. Penn's example and Franklin's after him inspired Franklin's esteemed Masonic brother, Jean-Francois Arouet, better known as Voltaire, a founder of the Enlightenment, to memorialize Quakers as the noblest kind of born-again European. Interesting. So perhaps the Quakers were seen as at that time to be perhaps the most malleable movement and population through which Jesuit operations could it's very interesting. Very interesting. Continuing on here, yet well-informed Englishmen neither saw Quaker nor regeneration in Penn's curiously compromising friendship with James II, who succeeded Charles II in 1685. What possible league could a Quaker have with the king? Exactly. That's the tell. Worse, a king converted to Roman Catholicism by Jesuits. Certainly no true Quaker could have written Penn's charter for the city of Philadelphia, which amounted to his gift of that estate of the Church of England. In the charter's preamble, Penn stated, I have, by virtue of the king's letters patent under the great seal of England, erected the said town into a borough, and do by these presents erect the said town and borough into a city. The name city in every case signifies the location of a bishop's see. City, interesting. The seat of his authority, from the Latin sedes, sedes, and the territory under his supervision. No place in England was called a city unless governed by a bishop, as in the see or city of Canterbury, see or city of New York, see or city of London, of Bath and Wales, of Bristol, of Salisbury, etc. Interesting. With the Philadelphia Charter, Penn erected for the persecuting Church of England a nearly invisible mechanism for recycling the very victims of its persecutions. Wow. Wow. So then, in a sense, the state of Pennsylvania became a sort of open air prison, an open air sort of like panopticon concentration camp under the visible under the watch and supervision and power of the Holy See, the Holy City, which is the Vatican. Wow. This is fascinating. Indeed, Penn's last will and testament, which became effective with his death in England in 1718 at the age of 74, turned all Pennsylvania into the same mechanism with these words, quote, the government of my province of Pennsylvania and territories thereunto belonging, and all powers relating thereto, I give and devise to the most honorable the Earl of Oxford, wow, and Earl Mortimer and their heirs upon trust, to dispose thereof to the Queen Anne, or to any other person to the best advantage and profit they can. Wow. With a stroke of Penn's quill, the children of the Quakers who had followed him out of the Church of England were literally given back. To become free of this bondage, the Quakers were obliged to align themselves with the Church of Rome, at least the Black Papacy. Wow. This alliance was facilitated by Benjamin Franklin, whose political career was built on defending the Quaker interests against the proprietary heirs, which were the Church of England. Against this common enemy, Franklin and the Quakers united, knowingly or unknowingly, with the designs of the Roman Church militant. I would say with the mass of Quakers at the time, probably unknowingly, they unwittingly went back into slavery. Wow. While the stones rolled unstoppably toward their objective. My God, this is shocking. This is shocking to me. But it's also just not. It makes so much sense. While the stones rolled unstoppably toward their objective, Jesuit General Luigi Centurioni died. Early in May of 1758, the general congregation arrived at Rome to choose his successor. On the last day of the month, the congregation unanimously elected Lorenzo Ricci, the society's spiritual father and secretary, as its 18th Black Pope. Ricci, professor of philosophy, theology, and the classics at the Roman College, was known for his patient, placid nature, his even temper. He inherited an organization in remarkably good shape. The Latin American missions were flourishing. A mission had just been established in Poland. Everywhere the schools and colleges were prospering. In the natural sciences, Jesuits were counted among the world's leading authorities. Their presence in economic and secular government had never been more imposing. As the papal nuncio to Vienna stated in a letter to his superior at the Vatican, quote, "The Jesuits have the upper hand over everything, even the most prominent ministers of state, and domineer over them if they do not carry out their will." End quote. But the Society's legendary power could hinder Catholic activity in the Protestant missions. To defeat Great Britain without a battle, Lorenzo Ricci required the abilities and resources of an important Maryland family, the Carrolls. The three Carroll sons, Daniel, John, and their first cousin Charles, all now in their 20s, had been trained in Jesuit warfare at St. Omer's. John was teaching there. Charles was studying law at the Jesuit college, Louis Le Grand in Paris, about to undertake further studies at London's Inner Temple. Of Daniel's activities between 1753 and 1781, very little is known. What is well known is that the Carroll lads were among the wealthiest Americans alive. The mother of Daniel and John, Eleanor Darnall, claimed direct descent from the Calverts, the owning family of original Maryland. She had come into possession of much of the land that Daniel would transfer to the District of Columbia. Charles Carroll stood to inherit America's largest private estate. Later, John Adams would label him America's richest citizen. Lorenzo Ricci could not win his war without the overt participation of the Carrolls, but New England was virulently Protestant. What Protestant leader would stoop to cooperate with devout Roman Catholics schooled in trickery by the all-powerful Jesuits? Would uniting with Jesuits not be laying America's future at the feet of the Bishop of Rome? In this consensus, Ricci was able to discern a valuable negative weapon. If the stones of envy and hatred were given a gentle nudge, their own weight and momentum would spectacularly blast the Society of Jesus to smithereens. With the Society out of the way, Roman Catholicism would hang in the wind, defenseless. To a Protestant's perception, the church would no longer be a forceful contender for political power. Sun-tzu advised a ruse known in the lingo of modern covert professionals as blown cover as cover. Right? A false disclosure of basically you fake your own death. You expose it so that you can bury it and drive it further underground, like what happened with MK Ultra in the 1970s with I think it was called the Church Commission, correct? Might be wrong. But basically, MK Ultra was exposed and it was, air quotes, shut down. But really, they didn't stop doing all of that research. It's too valuable for them. So they buried it deep, and it's been continuing ever since. You can guarantee that. Quote, "There will be times when you will lower yourself and others when you pretend to be afraid. Sometimes you will feign weakness so that your enemies, opening the door to presumption and pride, come to attack you unwisely. Give out false information about the state you are in. The enemy, believing it to be true, will act in consequence toward his generals and all the officers presently at his service." Yes, sudden misfortune would bless the society. Weakness and persecution would be transformed into magnificent new capital for building sympathetic relationships with other weak and persecuted people, such as the British colonists who were destined soon to become. Without detailing his strategy, for Sun Tzu says, "You will act in such a way that those who are inferior to you can never guess your intentions." Lorenzo Ricci affirmed to the general congregation that storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The congregation similarly gave its understanding in obedience to the hidden design of their new superior general, who occupied, after all, the place of Jesus. It issued a call for esprit to the brotherhood at large, quote, if God permitting it because of his hidden designs, which we could do nothing else but adore, we are to become the butt of adversity, the Lord will not abandon those who remain attached and united to him. And as long as the society is able to go to him with an open soul and a sincere heart, no other source of strength will be necessary for it. So keep all of this in mind when you think that in these elections when the Democrats are down and they're defeated. Okay, this happens every single election cycle, and what it does is it keeps the masses in the system. That's one level of the design by which this machine is able to keep itself going. It creates fear, it creates the problem so that it can deliver the solution. And we see already, after so many examples, that the Jesuits are very adept at creating both sides and pitting them against the other for their furtherance of power. This is how they maintain the power. Hey, let's pretend to go out of business, but meanwhile we'll just change the name on the sign, right? The Prime Minister of Portugal, Sebastian the Marquis de Pombal, had been conducting what the New Catholic Encyclopedia calls, quote, a long campaign of calumnies, false rumors, distorted manipulation of incidents, all intent on undermining the Jesuits' reputation by ascribing to them nefarious doctrines, purposes, and practices. Hey, real quick aside here, do you know what Mossad's modus operandi is? By deception, wage war. Play the victim while victimizing, right? Among Pombal's allegations were that the Jesuits had incited revolts in Paraguay, a Portuguese colony, had traded illegally, had even conspired to murder the king. Pombal supported his claim with numerous anti-Jesuit tracts and inflammatory pastoral letters, which he submitted to Parliament. In the Society's defense, a group of bishops showered Pope Clement XIII with letters commending the Jesuits for their invaluable work. Clement, known by Jesuit historians as a Jesuited pope, hastened to send copies of these endorsements to Lorenzo Ricci for publication under the title Catholic Ecclesiastical Judgment for the Present Status of the Society of Jesus. Publication of these endorsements would show the world that the society enjoyed the solid support of the Roman hierarchy. Significantly, Ricci declined to publish them. On January 19th, 1759, the Marquis de Pombal procured a royal decree expelling the Jesuits from Portugal and its overseas colonies. More than 1,000 Jesuit fathers were crammed into ships and dumped on the shores of the Papal States, then an area in central Italy, only slightly more spacious than Switzerland. 250 fathers were cast into dungeons, many perishing from maltreatment. The Portuguese crown seized all the society's houses, churches, and colleagues as well. Wow, this is sounding like the Hannibal Directive. You're willing to sacrifice and kill your own members, own people of faith, in order to maintain and secure power. Is this not what every government does? It just so happens, though, that the modern example right now is being seen in this Jesuit banker war over in Gaza, because that's what it is. Continue reading. Stones were then nudged in France. The superior of a Jesuit mission in the Caribbean, Pierre Lavallée, had obtained commercial credit to finance his mission in Martinique or whatever, When it happened that he could no longer pay his debt, a trading firm in Marseilles alleged damages against him of more than 2 million francs. Lavallee asked Lorenzo Ricci for help. Ricci turned him down. The firm sued the society in a French court and won. Ricci then appealed the case to the Parliament in Paris, which was more of a Supreme Court than a legislative body. His lawyers argued that the society could not be held liable for personal debts of its members due to a prohibition laid down by Saint Ignatius himself in the constitutions against any members doing business as a principal or partner. Although this claim was easily dismissible as a flimsy legal fiction, the court demanded evidence to support it. This required Lorenzo Ricci to produce the constitutions, which had never before been publicly revealed. When the volumes were brought to court and examined, the government attorneys had a field day. A lawyer from Brittany named La Châtelet charged that the Constitutions was a handbook of every known form of heresy, idolatry, and superstition, which provides tutelage in suicide, legicide, blasphemy, and every kind of impurity, usury, sorcery, murder, cruelty, hatred, vendetta, insurrection, and treason. Wow. So they got the Epstein list because Lorenzo Ricci said this will ultimately work toward our advantage and securing of power. We can go further underground. We can hone our spycraft. This is insane. And this might also explain why Trump is fumbling so badly over all of these issues, because he's installed to bring America further into decline so that it slides further into fascism, further into tyranny. And all the MAGA people, like all the Quakers of old under Penn, are none the wiser, and in fact probably support the idea because they've been deceived. Do you not see the past and also even present examples of Jesuit influence taking place? Jesuits. Sounds a lot like, quote, Jews to me. So it's not the Jews. It's a group of people who've sold their souls to Satan, who then conspire together to lay waste mankind for their own profit. That's all. It's a worldwide cabal of satanic pedophiles, in other words. And allegiance to Satan transcends race, gender, and socioeconomic status. Because low-level offenders are doing the same thing that the elite are doing the things that the elites do, because the elites are the ones who are designing it. So the elites are the ones actually designing the evil in the world. And then what they do is they put it into the world, and then they use it to entrap us and enslave us. And we're none the wiser to the fact that they're actually doing it themselves, but getting away from it or getting away with it, which is why you have the case where an Israeli guy who works in the Netanyahu government can come to the United States, which is a shell company of the Jesuits, of the bankers, of the Zio-fascist Jesuit banking entity known as the United States. He comes here, goes to Las Vegas, he solicits sex from a minor and gets away with it because the Attorney General of Nevada was in on it, the United States government is in on it, Mossad's in on it, and the Vatican's in on it. Bank of England is in on it. You can't just say it's just the Jews when it's also England with Jimmy Savile, the royal family, right? Come to the United States, same damn problems. So it's not just the Jews. So basically, Nazism, communism, socialism, Zionism, Catholicism, Islamism. All of these are the systems of control that have been designed by which these evil reprobates perpetuate their crimes against humanity. As the Lavallee case unfolded during 1759 and 1760, Benjamin Franklin's beloved Voltaire slammed the Jesuits in two satirical plays mounted on the Parisian stage. Educated in the humanities and theatrical arts by Jesuits at the College Louis le Grand, Voltaire served the society and the Catholic Church with distinction by becoming their chief critic and debunker, much in the way Will Rogers served Franklin Roosevelt's administration by lampooning New Deal politicians, or in the way Keystone Cops tickled an American for being transformed into a police state. Much like Saul of Tarsus, who also, don't forget, a Pharisee and Herodian, was a tent maker and is believed to also be in the realm of theater. Go to Jesus Words Only on YouTube, and you'll find a whole playlist regarding Saul of Tarsus, aka Paul the so-called apostle, that his tent making was actually in the theater realm. And so, again, the connections, like what I was talking about before, are just astounding. So anyway, Voltaire, uh, a theater nerd, serves who learned theater at a Jesuit college, becomes a so-called critic of the Catholics, of the Jesuits, right? But it's all by design. Tapped by none other than Ben Franklin, a Freemason, and so-called Quaker. Audiences at Candid howled at Jesuit buffoons strutting about self-importantly drilling their Paraguayan Indian troops. In the account of the sickness, confession, death, and apparition of the Jesuit Berthier, the editor of a Jesuit literacy review, who dies of sheer boredom, challenges the notion that the society is even worthy of existence. With his predecessor Blaise Pascal, whose provincial letters had altered whose provincial letters had alerted earlier generations of the egomania of high Jesuitry, Voltaire provided a spirit of ridicule, which gave Jesuit bashing the feel of good sport. I'm also calling to memory a Monty Python skit that I've seen with the Jesuits and the Inquisition. I wonder what sort of propaganda that may have served. A lot of these things that are in the public zeitgeist are things of so-called ridicule. But humor oftentimes is done to bring certain realities or facts into the public discussion. Like a lot of comedians talk about very taboo, controversial subjects in such a way where it breaks down that barrier because you're tapping into the absurdity of it through comedy, right? So doing it in that way lowers the barrier and brings certain things to the public consciousness that they otherwise would not be aware of. But it always serves a purpose. It can either enlighten or it can darken, it can obfuscate, it can blur the lines between reality and fiction, right? So think of a lot of the conspiracy theories that are brought into the public zeitgeist, and you have to look at when they're brought into the public zeitgeist. Why are they now allowing us to talk about, for example, this massive worldwide pedophile ring now, especially now that Trump's in office, right? because he's supposed to fight the deep state. Yet there's all this controversy and there's this obviously fumbling of the ball. But not long ago, there was this controversy called Pizzagate, which when that was being brought into the public conversation, it was immediately dismissed as buffoonery, as crackpot conspiracy, something that is just utterly impossible. But now it's popular to talk about that sort of thing. So it's just very interesting how these things come and go and how entertainment and news media and all of these things are used to sort of turn on and off the spigot of public opinion because they need something to divide us. When really we should be seeing these things and observing and recognizing the patterns of abuse, and it should bring us together. But they've mastered the art of psychological operation, warfare, to where they've weaponized it. And that's how they keep us divided. This is how they keep power in their hands. I cannot stop seeing this pattern, and it just bears repeating. I will repeat this ad nauseum until people finally begin to understand that these are the systems and mechanisms of control. The banks, the fiat currency, the wars, the cultural wars, all of this is by Jesuit machination. This is what the function and purpose of every secret society is. And Mossad is a secret society. CIA is a secret society. MI6 is a secret society. These are compartmentalized hubs of one giant satanic pedophilic cult. That's all it is. They're just different access points, different nodes that they've set up around the world for their operations. That's all it is. It's really that simple. Which is why I no longer support the idea that it's the Jews or it's the Jesuits or it's the Freemasons. It's all one satanic pedophilic cabal. Do you not understand that? People don't. Because they love the Jesuit theater a little too much. I like Jesuit theater. I think it's funny a lot of times, and I think that it's insightful a lot of times, but I watch it knowing what it is. I watch it able to decode what they're telling me. A lot of people, they take it as purely entertainment, and they're none the wiser, and they keep sleepwalking into tyranny. But I'm sitting here reading their stuff, watching their stuff, listening to their stuff, trying to decode it and bring it to you, because things are going to get a hell of a lot worse before they get better. So let's continue reading here. Lorenzo Ricci's handling of the Lavette case resulted in a resolution passed by Parliament on August 6, 1762, condemning the Jesuits as endangering the Christian faith, disturbing the peace of the church, and in general building up far less than they destroy. The resolution continued, the Society of Jesus, by its very nature, is inadmissible in any properly ordered state as contrary to natural law, attacking all temporal and spiritual authority, intending to introduce into church and state under the specious veil of a religious institute, not an order truly aspiring towards evangelical perfection, but rather a political organization whose essence consists in a continual activity by all sorts of ways, direct and indirect, secret and public, to gain absolute independence, and then the usurpation of all authority. They outrage the laws of nature, and as enemies of the laws of France should be irrevocably expelled. Louis XV being an absolute monarch, parliamentary resolutions were worthless without his signature. Louis being obedient to his Jesuits, it was highly unlikely that he would ever sign a resolution condemning the Jesuits. Yet sign it he did, and why he did has remained a point of debate. Some say his mistress, Madame de Pompadour, craved vengeance against court Jesuits for implacably denying her a mass. Others say the king needed Parliament's favor to bail him out of debt. I submit that Louis signed because Lorenzo Ricci wanted him to. And I think that, you know, I think that that's probably just the most likely thing because it's the simplest explanation. Otherwise, there's always intrigue upon intrigue upon intrigue with this, but sometimes I think it's just a matter of Grima Wormtongue sitting next to King Theoden saying, he is not welcome here. When the resolution became law, Ricci released the French Jesuits from their vows. The society as an institution ceased to exist on French soil. Louis consented to allow the Jesuits to remain in France, but as regular clergy. Others went into exile. Pierre Lavallée, whose financial problems had brought on the debacle, was exiled by Ricci to live the rest of his life as a private citizen in England. When the war that had begun in the Ohio Valley reached Martinique, the English occupied that tiny island and took over the Jesuit plantations, selling them, slaves and all, for more than enough money to have paid off Lavallee's debts. In the midst of their decomposing glory, the Jesuits received from Clement the 13th an awesome gift designed to make welcome the most humiliating of circumstances. This was the Mass and Office of the Sacred Heart with its icon of a realistically bloody heart plucked from Christ's ribcage and ignited by an eternal flame. Based on visions resulting from the spiritual exercises made by Saint Margaret Marie Alacoque, 1647 to 90, as promoted by her Jesuit spiritual director Claude de la Colombière, Sacred Heart is a Gnostic Jesuit production centering on the Savior's perfect humanity. By devotion to my heart, Jesus supposedly revealed to Alacoque, tepid souls shall grow fervent, and fervent souls shall quickly mount to high perfection. Sacred Heart summons true believers to pay a debt of reparation for the world's sins. The debt is payable only by prayers, penances, masses, and, significantly for this epoch in the society's history, social action. John Carroll, so indispensable for the outworking of the American Revolution, was profoundly devoted to Sacred Heart. Wow. So that's the origin of Sacred Heart. I never knew that. So again, it's a weird MK Ultra trigger. This imagery of Sacred Heart, this lore behind Sacred Heart is used to basically trigger something in the mind of someone who's devoted to such things into perpetual service to the church. So whatever the church says you do. We have to bring about, social action and all these things, but it's always defined by the Vatican. Okay. Louis the 15th was the effective head of the Family Compact, an agreement between reigning Bourbon monarchs to present a united front before the rest of the world, quote, on important measures. Once he had dissolved the Jesuits in France, he advised other Bourbons to do likewise. Although he could not name anything to be gained politically, economically, or financially by the society's dissolution, the issue, quote, still remains puzzling and problematic, end quote, Professor Martin says, unless considered, I submit, in light of sun-tzu and ruse. At any rate, the Bourbon Charles III of Spain followed Louis's advisory. Charles convened a special commission to prepare a master plan for ousting the Jesuits. No one could produce any hard evidence against the society, but there were plenty of rumors. A mob that had risen up to protest a law Charles had passed forbidding the wearing of wide sombreros was said to have been fomented by Jesuits. A rumor swept across Spain that the Jesuits were nursing a plot to assassinate Charles. The Jesuits supposedly had proof that the king was technically a bastard and should be deposed. None of these rumors were ever substantiated. Moreover, General Ricci ordered the Jesuits to do nothing to dispel them. The result was that 46 of the 60 Spanish bishops decided that Spain should follow the Marquis de Pombal and oust the society. And so the commission drafted an expulsion order, which Charles signed on February 27th, 1767. The order was executed by ambush, reminiscent of Philip the Ninth's move against the Knights Templar in 1312. Charles sent out sealed envelopes marked not to be opened before sunrise of April 2nd on pain of death to all provincial viceroys and military commanders. When sunrise came and the recipients opened their envelopes, they discovered 2 letters inside. The first ordered them to place troops around the Jesuit residences and colleges during the night of April 2nd, to arrest all Jesuits, and to arrange them to be placed aboard waiting ships at certain docks. If a single Jesuit, concluded the king, even though sick or dying, is still to be found in the area under your command after the embarkation, prepare yourself to face summary execution. The second letter was a copy of King Charles's original order of expulsion, which began, quote, being swayed by just and legitimate reasons which shall remain sealed within my royal breast forever. Wow, talk about immunity. And went on to say that, quote, all members of the Society of Jesus are to leave my kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and other formerly independent kingdoms that made up Spain, and all their goods are declared forfeit by virtue of the highest power, which the Lord God Almighty has confided into my hands. The king made sure to discourage any investigation into causes. Quote, it is not for subjects to question the wisdom or to seek to interpret the decisions of their sovereign, end quote. Only days before April 2nd, the Spanish ambassador to the Holy See presented a document from Charles to Pope Clement XIII that explained, quote, your Holiness knows as well as anyone else that a sovereign's first duty is to ensure the peace of his dominions and the tranquility of his subjects. In the fulfillment of this sovereign task, I have found it necessary to expel all the Jesuits residing in my kingdoms and to commit them directly to your Holiness's wise stewardship in the states of the Church. I beg your Holiness to consider that my decision is unalterable and has been made as a result of mature reflection and all due consideration for the consequences. End quote. Clement, the likelihood of whose submission to the will of Lorenzo Ricci should not be underestimated, responded in a melodramatic vein, as though playing for an audience, quote, of all the shocks I have had to endure in the 9 unhappy years of my pontificate, this one, of which your majesty has informed me, is the worst. End quote. The Pope had little more to say, except that the king may have placed himself in danger of eternal damnation. The order was executed during the night of April 2nd and 3rd. Some 1,000 Jesuits were rounded up throughout Spain. They were crammed into the lower decks of 22 water ships. In May 1767, the gruesome fleet appeared off Civitavecchia, the port of the Papal States, and, amazingly, was fired upon by shore artillery. The ships were denied permission to land their human cargo by order of the Pope himself, pursuant to a conference with Lorenzo Ricci. Wow! Historians are at a loss to explain why Clement, so devoted to the Jesuits, would impose such cruelty upon his beloveds in their hour of need. The most plausible answer, I would suggest, is that his understanding was obedient to the inscrutable command of his general, whose exceedingly private objective, after all, was to disqualify the Society of Jesus and the Roman Catholic Church as viable enemies of Protestantism, at least in the North American colonies. No longer enemies, they could develop personal alliances. The suffering priests, the guns of Civitavecchia, were all explained in Amito's sun-tzu. Your army, quote, your army, accustomed to not knowing your plans, will be equally unaware of the peril which threatens it. A good general takes advantage of everything, even deceiving the people that he commands. These are our soldiers. These are our law enforcement. uneducated thugs who do the unwitting, who obey the commands of their superiors unwittingly. Everything is for plausible everything is designed for plausible deniability. So here we see what I might consider what I would call the death of the first horn, and then there's a revival of the second horn, which we can talk about later. But anyway, he can only do that because he has operated in the greatest secrecy, because he know how to remain cool-headed, and because he governs with uprightness. At the same time, however, his men are constantly misled by what they see and hear. He manages for his troops never to know what they must do, nor what orders they must receive. If his own people are unaware of his plans, how can the enemy discover them? Over the next few months, thousands more Jesuits were expelled from the remaining Bourbon states of Naples, Parma, Malta, and Spanish America. Jesuits in French America, like Quebec and New England, were left undisturbed, as were those in Austria. In October 1768, the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa A. Habsburg wrote her Jesuit confessor, Father Koffler, quote, "My dear Father, there is no cause for concern. As long as I am alive, you have nothing to fear." But Maria Theresa hoped to marry her two daughters to Bourbon princes, Caroline to the son of the Spanish king, Marie Antoinette to the son of Louis XV. Bourbon ambassadors advised her that unless she expelled the Jesuits, she would have to look elsewhere for sons-in-law. The Empress reneged on her promise to Father Koffler, expelled the Jesuits, and the girls got their men. Marie Antoinette's marriage would end with the execution of her husband, Louis XVI, in January 1793. 9 months later, she would die the same way, decapitated by the guillotine. This device bears the name of the French revolutionist who, in 1792, first suggested its use in administering the death penalty, Dr. Joseph Guillotine. Dr. Guillotine was a disestablished Jesuit. Wow. No wonder we see beheading imagery in the book of Revelation. There's going to be coming beheadings. A lot of people who read Revelation would say. So the end times, we're going to see a sort of revival in this thing. You know, we see it even in modern times as well, in the Islamist religion. And then just, we hear all the time just the atrocities happening over in the Middle East, time and time again, whether it's allegedly Hamas or IDF. Either way, there's always reports of decapitated babies, right? So the Jesuits love decapitation. Vlad the Impaler, right? These sorts of figures, you really have to start to revisit, question, and wonder. In January 1769, the ambassadors from France, Spain, and Portugal visited Clement XIII to demand the complete and utter suppression of the Society of Jesus. Clement called for a special consistory of the College of Cardinals to deliberate the question. But when the cardinals convened February 3rd, it was not to discuss Bourbon ultimatums, but to choose Clement's successor. For the 76-year-old Pope had died the night before of an apoplectic attack, said the official record, a heart attack attributed to the pressures applied by the Bourbon diplomats. For nearly 3 months, one question charged the turbulent conclave: should the next pope be for or against the Jesuits? The cardinal's choice of Lorenzo Ganganelli was a triumph for Lorenzo Ricci. Although Ganganelli was a Franciscan, he had colleagued with Jesuits as a special consultant to the Inquisition. His celebrated book, Diatriba Theologica, 1743, had been dedicated to Ignatius Loyola. Moreover, Ganganelli literally owed his papacy to Lorenzo Ricci, as it was Ricci who had sponsored his nomination for cardinal in 1759. Almost immediately after receiving the red hat, Ganganelli had shown evidence of cooperating with General Ricci's strategy of gradually disestablishing the Society of Jesus. Real quick here, an aside, an earlier podcast episode, I actually looked at the significance, not the total significance, it wasn't a deep dive, but we looked at red hat symbolism. And it's funny that Donald Trump, who is fifth level MAGA, which is fifth level Satanist, um, had red hats. There's also black MAGA as well. But I just wanted to make that comment there. So continue reading. Oxford Book of Popes indicates a sudden and unexplainable habit change. Quote, hitherto regarded as a friend of the Jesuits, Cardinal Ganganelli now distanced himself from them. End quote. And now a decade later, calling himself Clement the 14th, Ganganelli presented what the Catholic Encyclopedia calls, in appearance, a hostile attitude toward the Jesuits, an apparent hostility, a theatrical hostility that masked and involved loyalty toward the society. Clement the 14th would do whatever was necessary to help the society win victory without doing battle, even if it meant obliterating the society. The Bourbons needed appeasing. Hastily, Clement promised Charles III of Spain forthcoming documents necessary to proclaim to all the world that the wisdom of your Majesty's decision to expel the Jesuits was unruly and rebellious subjects. He assured Louis XV of France also of a plan for the complete suppression of the society. On Maundy Thursday, 1770, Clement omitted the annual reading of In Coena Domini on the Lord's Supper. The omission was an astonishing statement. This celebrated bull, first proclaimed in 1568 by Pope Pius V, arrogantly reminded kings that they were but vassals of the papacy. Suddenly discontinuing this assertion flattered the royal self-importance, inviting crowned heads to stay on the anti-Jesuit, anti-church track so necessary for the fulfillment of Lorenzo Ricci's secret designs in England and America, which was to bring them closer. It surely evidences Clement's involvement in the strategy of feigned weakness in order to conceal what Sun Tzu called an order that nothing can interrupt. The non-reading of In Coena Domini rang the death knell of the strong-armed white papacy as manifest by Ricci's political theorist, Justinius Febronius, and his 1763 masterpiece on the state of the church and the legitimate power of the Roman pontiff, about which more presently. For more than 80 years, the papacy had supported Rome-based members of the Stuart monarchs exiled from England for being Roman Catholics. Not only did Clement XIV diminish this tradition by almost nothing, in 1772 he began extending a highly visible and most cordial hospitality to the Protestant King George III and his family. This tableau was enormously disturbing to American Protestants, who at the same time were having extreme difficulties with George. The prospect of England reuniting with Rome gave them all the more reason to strive for what Lorenzo Ricci wanted, their independence. Air quotes. Finally, on July 21st, 1773, Clement XIV delivered on his promise by signing the brief Dominus ac Redemptor Noster, quote, God and our Redeemer. The brief dissolved, suppressed, disbanded, and abolished the Society of Jesus for all eternity, so as, quote, to establish a real and enduring peace within the church. All the Jesuits' offices, authorities, and functions were declared null and void, and all their houses, colleges, hospices, and any other places occupied them to be hereby disestablished, no matter in what province, state, or kingdom they might be found. Kind of like how they dismantled MK Ultra, right? Like how when the government finds corruption within itself and it exposes it and shuts down the program and closes the books and says, well, Glad that's taken care of. Meanwhile, it's driven further down into further secrecy, into further um confidentiality. They call it the deep state for a reason. Clement appointed 5 cardinals, an archbishop, a bishop, 2 theologians, and other ecclesiastical dignitaries to supervise the disestablishment. None of the confiscated Jesuit records, correspondence, and accounts showed any incriminating evidence, although Lorenzo Ricci lived a short walk from the Pope's palace at St. Peter's. Notice of the disestablishment was not served upon him until mid-August. Guards took the general into custody at his offices in number 45, Piazza del Gesù. They removed him to the English College a few blocks away. He remained there 5 weeks. Things were then happening in England and America that make Ricci's presence in the English College extraordinarily significant. We shall consider those happenings in a forthcoming chapter. This is kind of like how they, this again reminds me of just like the so-called arrests and exiles of prominent elites, right? Like Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein, who did not kill himself, right? The guy who was caught in Las Vegas, Nevada, but who was secreted away back to Israel, right? The escape of Hitler and high-ranking Nazi officials to Argentina, right? How all these Nazi scientists and psychologists and researchers got split between all these different Western and Eastern nations through things like Operation Paperclip, right? Just a reshuffling of the deck. Toward the end of September, Lorenzo Ricci was taken from the English College to Castle Angelo, a medieval fortress whose dungeons suggest a prison. His detention was probably less demeaning than we might imagine, as St. Angelo contained quite elegant rooms. Popes often used them as a convenient resort from administrative stresses. In fact, a secret underground tunnel connected St. Angelo to the papal palace at the Vatican. It would be consistent with Lorenzo Ricci's position and strategy for him to stay in personal secret contact with Clement XIV by means of this tunnel. On September 2nd, or 22nd, 1774, the first anniversary of Ricci's detention at St. Angelo, Clement died. He was 69. He had suffered the last year of his life in severe depression, it was said, with morbid paranoia over assassination. His corpse decomposed rapidly, feeding rumors of death by poison, rumors which his famous last words tended to confirm. Mercy, mercy, compulsus feci. I was compelled to do it. For many years afterward, historians would wonder just whom Ganganelli was addressing. God? A vengeful Jesuit assassin? Ricci? What was the it he was compelled to do? Disestablish the Jesuits? Commit suicide? The definitive answer may never be known, because the Pope's personal papers and effects decomposed as rapidly as his flesh. What is quite known, though, is that the death of Clement XIV, in the words of Oxford Book of Popes, quote, brought the prestige of the papacy to its lowest level in centuries, which is precisely what Lorenzo Ricci needed for his American Revolution to happen. We now proceed to examine the structured darkness of the men who led the attack against the Society of Jesus. It was the same darkness from whence came not only the Englishmen who turned their kingdom into a hated tyranny, but also the Americans who advocated rebellion against that tyranny. The darkness is called Freemasonry, and it is the subject of our next chapter. Wow, what an amazing chapter. And it helps me, at least, to connect a lot of the dots that I've found in my journey in trying to understand just who runs the world, what's going on, why all these wars, why all this division, why all this suffering, why all of this deceit, who's to blame? And I think that these dots are being very well connected here. So next week, or rather next time I read this book, it'll be chapter 13, The Secret Bridge. And that will be page 140 on the PDF. So you can mark that down. And again, you can read ahead or you can just listen and follow along. But next time we will be page 140 in the PDF here. Or if you have the physical copy, page 117. So until next time, stay in the fear of God, keep the commandments of God, follow the Lord Jesus Christ, worship the true Creator, the Father, in spirit and in truth, and sharpen your discernment because we are infiltrated by agents of Satan. Have a good day.
Thank you for watching. What Jesus says to one, he says to all. Repent and believe the gospel, for the kingdom of God and of heaven is at hand.